parts of the world. When I speak on campuses in various countries, but especially in the US, the country that crushes me the most, or the question rather that crushes me the most is, you have a feminist movement in Egypt, and I want to pull my hair out. And I want to say, how much time do you have so I can sit you down and tell you about the feminist movement in Egypt? That, started at least 2 centuries ago, a century and a half ago, when we had women in Egypt at the turn of the 20th century who were marching alongside men against British occupation, who after Egypt, or even before we were liberated and we got rid of the British and we got rid of the monarchy in Egypt, were demanding equal rights for women because they could see a time when the need for women on the streets with men would not be so crucial anymore, and when that role of women alongside men, as we're discussing today in countries like Tunisia and Egypt, could be forgotten. And so these women demanded not to be forgotten. And so you had women like Hoda Sha'rawi, who returned to Egypt from a feminist conference in Italy in 1923 and removed her face veil at a Cairo train station and said, this is a thing of the past. This is niqab now, which we're still discussing today, almost 100 years later. And an Egyptian woman was taking a stand on niqab in Cairo as part of her feminist drive, as part of her launch of a feminist movement. Now, her feminist movement in Egypt didn't necessarily speak for all women in the region, or for all women in Egypt, but that's fine. It spoke to her particular group, and there were other women at the same time, alongside Hoda Sha'rawi, who launched their own drives and movements to express their voices. And many of them launched independent magazines, many of them went on hunger strike, many of them were out on the streets demanding the right to vote, demanding the right to be heard, demanding the right to enter parliament in Egypt. All of them speaking from different social backgrounds, speaking from different economic backgrounds, but ultimately speaking as women during the last century. So again, this is not something that was invented 4 or 5 months ago in the Middle East and North Africa. This is something that we are very proud of in the Middle East and North Africa. And it's something that I urge you to remember, especially when we speak to each other as women, and we want to know how, as women across the world, we can help each other. And this need to speak out and this need to organize. I mentioned, excuse me if I stop every now and then because I'm fighting a cold and exhaustion, but it's a happy exhaustion, so it's a good kind of exhaustion. This need to organize and this need to speak out, especially for the women that I mentioned in Egypt at the turn of the last century, was also a precursor to what we're seeing in social media today. Because the most subversive thing a woman can do is to speak about her personal life as if it mattered, as if it was really important. Regardless of who her father is, regardless of who her family is, but she, the individual woman, is important. And so the idea of autobiography and a woman sitting down and speaking in the I, and speaking as the individual, and saying, you must listen to my story because I am important. This is something that we have in the legacy of those incredible women during the last century in Egypt, and this is something that many of us now have access to, thanks to social media. Again, social media did not create this self-awareness and this importance of the I. But what social media in the Middle East and North Africa did was it gave the most marginalized groups, and they were mostly young people, who, as you've heard many times so far today, are the majority in that part of the world. So if the majority of that part of the world, young people, are most marginalized by dictators who do not give them any kind of economic, political, or cultural opportunities, within that marginalized group, even more of the marginalized group are women and minorities, sexual minorities, religious minorities, but generally I'm going to focus on women, and within the group as women, I will also look at sexual minorities. Because when you combine this, speaking as the I, when you combine the subversive power of the personal narrative, because the personal is political, because as Lena mentioned, the revolution, excuse me, the revolution is very personal. This is where the power of women online comes in, because even before the revolution started, women were telling their stories in regions such as Saudi Arabia and Iraq, and I'll begin my story with them especially, and telling stories to parts of the world in English, therefore using English, telling their stories to other parts of the world that would normally never hear these voices. My first example is from Saudi Arabia, and I'm especially obsessed with Saudi Arabia for many reasons. And I won't talk about Saudi too much because Hala Dosari is from here. She's going to give you a fantastic overview of Saudi Arabia. But my family moved to Saudi Arabia when I was 15 from the UK, and it completely turned my life upside down. And I became a feminist in Saudi, and I joke that there are two options for women in Saudi Arabia. You either lose your mind or you become a feminist. So I became a feminist. And I became a feminist thanks to a place very much like this, but it was the university library. I spent my first 2 years of university at the King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah. And it was driving me crazy because I was studying literature, but no one around me seemed to care about literature as much as I did. So I spent most of my day in the university library. And on the shelves of that library, I found the most subversive books that you would never imagine you'd find in Saudi Arabia. So God bless whatever professor put those books on the library, because they were feminist journals and they were books by feminists like Nawal Saadawi, like Fatima Mernissi from Morocco. Nawal Saadawi is a well-known Egyptian feminist. Fatima Mernissi is a sociologist and feminist from Morocco, and others, not just from the Middle East and North Africa, but also of Western background. And I remember when I first came across these books, I was terrified, because they were challenging so many of the things that I was taught as an Egyptian woman, as a Muslim woman, of what it meant to be a good Egyptian woman, of what it meant to be a good Muslim woman. And I kept going back to those books again and again, even though they scared the hell out of me. And I learned then, at the age of 18, 19, not only was I becoming a feminist, but the power and the importance of fear. Because when something scares you, it means that it's something that is really important to you. It's touching you on a very deep level. And whenever people ask me, should I choose this or should I choose that, when they're having some kind of dilemma in their career or personal life or whatever it is, I always tell them, choose the thing that scares you the most. Because the thing that scares you the most is often the thing that you need the most. Which is why I kept going back to those books. Because I needed them the most, because I was in Saudi Arabia at a time when he was going through a lot of political and fundamentalist change. We arrived in Saudi Arabia in 1982, which was a few years after the holiest place for Muslims, the Grand Mosque in Mecca, had been overtaken by a group of radicals who held it hostage basically for 3 weeks, and it took the help of French commandos to help the Saudi royal family liberate, essentially, Islam's holiest site. And a lot of people forget that that was a huge turn for Saudi Arabia. Again, Saudi Arabia didn't just become, this ultra-conservative kingdom. There were a lot of political and religious alliances and shifts and changes, and one of them came in 1979, when this hijacking of Mecca, essentially, happened in, I think it was November of 1979. So my family arrived in Saudi Arabia in 1982, just 3 years later, and this was, 1979 was also the invasion of Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden, the CIA, all of that, I'm sure you're all familiar with. But what it did to Saudi Arabia was the Saudi royal family, as it has many times in the past, struck one of many deals with the ultra-conservative clerics, where they basically said, if you help us against these radicals who took Mecca hostage, we will give you things like the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Religion, essentially people's hearts and minds. And there's nothing more crucial in that area where the heart and mind intersect than women and women's rights. And that's where you began to see Saudi women disappearing from television. Before 1979, you could see some women on Saudi television. But after 1979, when this deal was struck between the Saudi royal family and the conservative clerics to protect the Saudi royal family, essentially, women were removed from television. No more cinemas, no more mixing in public between the genders, a much stricter enforcing of gender segregation. So again, this history does not begin with one chapter or another. When you look throughout the history of Saudi Arabia, it's gone through many changes. And my family happened to arrive at a particularly difficult time where the ultra-conservatives were really coming into their fore. So experiencing those books in the library was definitely what I needed the most. And it basically planted the seeds of feminism in my soul that have been developing ever since. So as difficult as my years in Saudi Arabia were, it essentially made me the woman that I am. So for that, I thank Saudi Arabia, even though it's been a very difficult journey. So that, I will leap from there to 2005, when I first became familiar with blogs from the Middle East and North Africa. And one of my favorites at the time, because of my obsession with Saudi Arabia, was a blog called Saudi Girl. And I would go and visit this blog, and she was delightful. She would write about how she was a very liberal young woman whose dream it was to vote. And back then, no one was voting in Saudi Arabia. Now, only men get to vote in municipal elections, and I'll touch on that a bit later. Her dream was to go and vote wearing a t-shirt and jeans and flip-flops so that you could see her nail polish and her toe rings. And on her blog, she would write about her boyfriend. She would post her letters to Saudi editors-in-chief. in which she would demand that they would support Saudi women's rights to vote, and then she would post their letters in response to her, and people would write to her from all over the world, and she would reply. 2 years later, in 2007, when I was asked to write an essay about blogging in the Arab world, I went back to Saudi Girl's blog to see how she was doing, and I like to tell the story again and again. So if anyone here has heard it before, forgive me, but it's one of my favorite stories about the creativity and the kind of the dissidence within blogging itself. So I go back to Saudi Girl's blog in 2007 because I want to interview her for my essay. And there's an announcement on Saudi Girl's blog that says, "Dear readers, thank you for following my blog, but I wish to inform you that I am actually a man, not a woman." So I had been reading this blog all these years thinking it was about a Saudi woman, and it was actually a blog written by a Saudi man. And he explains that he wrote this blog, because I wrote to him, the Saudi Girl was Aliyah. This is an Arabic woman's name called Aliyah. So he comes out now as Ali. So I wrote to him, listen to me, Ali, what the hell, man? I was promoting this blog that you write in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club. I'm telling diplomats at the State Department they must read your blog. And you've been a boy all along. And he said, oh God, Mona, I'm so sorry, I hope I haven't gotten you into trouble. But he explained in his email to me and on his blog, and this is really the beauty of his blog. He said, I wanted my fellow men in Saudi Arabia to understand what it's like to be a woman in this country. I wanted them to walk in the footsteps of a woman. And so in that way, he was doing the exact opposite of, and I told you about my love for literature and all that, of people like George Eliot and other women during Victorian era England, when women had to pretend to be men so that they could be published, because a woman couldn't possibly write a novel. But here in 21st century Saudi Arabia is a man pretending to be a woman so that his blog could be taken seriously. So just digest that for a few minutes and think about this wonderful creativity behind his blog. And now he by no means was saying Saudi women must be silent and Saudi men will be for them, because that's the antithesis of what he was saying. He's saying that I'm supporting Saudi women, because during that time, and after that time especially, we've seen many more blogs by real Saudi women. And by real, I mean I know who they are, I've communicated with them, and there's an incredible one called Iman, I forgot her family name, but her blog is Saudi Woman, and she's real. And I assign my students to interview her. And the wonderful thing about her blog is she's taken Ali's intention from Saudi Girl blog, and that is to basically shake into awareness any Saudi who's not aware, as if that's possible. But when you lead a very comfortable lifestyle, it is very possible to soften the edges of oppression, to soften the edges of this demand and desire for freedom and dignity. And she often tells my students when they interview her, when I teach classes on gender and social media in the Middle East, she tells them I write this blog because I recognize I live in a golden cage. I lead a very privileged and affluent life in Saudi Arabia, but at the end of the day, it is a cage. And my blog is my way of breaking out of that cage, of saying what it's like to be a woman in Saudi Arabia, expressing the I in Saudi Arabia, telling anybody who cares to listen what it's like. And she will give you these wonderful moments in her life where she is resisting in whatever way she can. So one day she was in an elevator with one of these morality police officers who belong to the Committee to Promote Virtue and Prevent Vice, called in Saudi Arabia al-Hay'a, because that's the first Arabic word of the long title of this. It's basically a kind of a paramilitary of some sort that is affiliated to the Saudi Interior Ministry that has the right to detain you for 24 hours if they consider you have violated public morality in any way. And again, a particular focus and obsession for them is women. So she was writing in an elevator once where they became now real form. They moved from the virtual world into the real world. And my first experience with this book was my first experience with Beirut. I first visited Beirut in May of 2009. And the first thing I did that night could only happen in Beirut. And that was the book launch for Barid Mistajid. At the time, could only happen in Beirut. I'm hoping it happens in Cairo, in Tunisia, in Yemen, in Syria, in many places. But back in 2009, it could only happen in Beirut because of that greater